Hello everyone, my name's Ella and welcome to 100 Stories Deep. Today I'm going to be reading Peter Pan by Eka Kurniawan, which is from this book of his short stories called Kitchen Curse. Now I actually bought this book right at the start of the lockdown period to keep me sort of engaged in reading something interesting and new, and I will be sharing quite a few stories from this collection through this project. However, the story I've chosen today I think it's really interesting in the way that the author uses the fictional character of Peter Pan, as well as this fairy tale-like style of storytelling, to recount a very real moment in Indonesia's history, which was the overthrowing of the brutal dictator Suharto in 1998 through popular protests. And this story focuses specifically on the role of the student movement in that period. Peter Pan. The princess still remembers how she met that infuriating person, the discourteous man who kept her waiting. And she was willing to wait forever, even if it meant she ended up an old maid. It was just a few years before his most subversive action, and he was just sitting there on the stairs with a downcast face. The princess approached and tried to cheer him up, because she couldn't bear to see such crumpled frown. The man, who had already decided the 10th of April was to be their wedding day, looked up and said, "You're so pretty." He was really quite impertinent, but then his true complaints came out, even though it seemed too painful to discuss. A certain book by Immanuel Kant had been eaten by a bookworm or a mouse, its pages falling out, whole sections of certain chapters lost, and paper left in tatters all over our campus library. He said it wasn't worth the trouble stealing books like that, and that was what was making him so miserable. They were both new students at the time, and the princess soon got to know him better. He was typically as unhappy as on that first occasion, because he found life maddening, and he was indeed a book thief. He confessed to stealing books anywhere he could, from the biggest libraries and chain bookstores to little second-hand shops in every far-flung corner of the city. He said that stealing books was a despicable thing, and he did it hoping to be caught and consequently reassured that the government loved books and hated book thieves. But clearly he was nothing but a miserable wretch. He had never been arrested, even though he had stolen thousands of volumes. "Against such a rotten government," he declared once. The princess would never forget the day, because immediately after, Peter Pan professed his love for her. "We must launch a guerrilla war." And it wasn't just hot air. He really would have done it if he hadn't ended up carrying out his most subversive action first, during the year everything boiled over. He didn't have the chance to begin his guerrilla war, because it seemed like everything was already coming to an end. In his own way, though, he tried to realise his vision. He plastered his dorm room with Che Guevara posters and obsessively contacted guerrilla fighters around the globe. He scoured the thousands of stolen books piled high in his room, just looking for a good excuse to start his war. The princess told him people were desperately poor everywhere, while officials lived in luxury. International debt had driven the state to the brink of bankruptcy. The dictator had been in power far too long and needed to make way for someone who might have an actual talent for leading the country. According to the princess, that was reason enough to start a war. But Peter Pan demurred. He said everyone knows those are good reasons, and yet somehow no one ever starts a war in response. "It's better if we go to war for a more logical cause," he said. "Specifically for the government's failure to capture me, the library book thief." And so he moved forward with his plan. He initiated his first political action by demonstrating in front of the campus library, along with 10 of his friends, who, according to him, were the front line of his rebel forces. And that gang of kids, looking more like a youth soccer team than would-be guerrillas, started yelling their slogans at 9 o'clock sharp when the library was at its most crowded. They also sang, and they concluded with the revolutionary demand: "Give those books the humanitarian treatment they deserve." In the end, the demonstration wasn't popular. The newspaper didn't cover it, and it elicited nothing but scorn from fellow students. This obsessive man didn't expand his cadre, and he actually lost all 10 of his 10 potential fighters. It was quite a bitter memory for him. But from the fierce look in his eye, people could see he was not a youth who easily gave up. And what's more, he actually had an extraordinary talent for gathering people together, for organising and radicalising them, especially through his poetry. This kid, who in all honesty had no talent as a poet, gained many faithful followers at his readings. His poetry, which had a whiff of romanticism about it, hypnotised many who read or heard it. The princess still remembered how, not long before that subversive day, the president himself had taken the time to make a surprise visit to the city and meet with this guy in his dorm room, accompanied by just one single bodyguard. The princess was there at the time. She and Peter Pan had just been enjoying a little make-out session, and the president said, "Mr. Poet, I hate your poetry. It pierces me right to my heart, and it wounds me. Stop reading it, and above all, writing it." After that, the president disappeared. Who knows how he vanished so quickly? Half an hour later, he reappeared on a live TV broadcast of a cabinet meeting, brimming with jokes that weren't funny. Meanwhile, the princess's lover just laughed, smoked 3 whole packs of cigarettes in an attempt to relax, and told the princess that the president's words to him were akin to a declaration of war, and he would heed them. At that point, he had already acquired the name Peter Pan. By and large, the monkey seemed apt. It had been years and years, and he still hadn't graduated college. By the time the princess had been awarded her doctorate, he hadn't even earned his bachelor's. People accused him of not wanting to grow up, wanting to stay a student forever, wanting to be a perpetual teenager. Peter Pan didn't really mind, because he liked the idea of adopting the name of a fictional character. Plus, he figured accepting the name didn't have to mean accepting the rationale behind it. He knew the delay arose from his revolutionary activities, which had taken up more and more of his time until he could no longer spare a moment to visit the lecture hall. One day, not long after his first failed demonstration, he met a guy who sold used imported books and had opened a small bookstore in the tourist district. Most of his customers were white tourists who came to buy novels or guidebooks or occasionally sell or barter their own volumes. Sometimes a student would come in, but usually just to look and hardly ever buy, because students rarely had any money. Peter Pan went there with the princess after it was recommended by a friend, who actually held a grudge against the bookseller and was hoping that Peter Pan's stealing would bankrupt the guy. But something quite different occurred. Peter Pan became rather close with the shop owner, since they both loved to read. He told the shop owner about his library of books. "Really, I have quite a lot. 3,000. I want to sell them all." And just then, the seed of a plan blossomed in his brilliant brain, and he continued to raise money for a guerrilla war. Ultimately, those books did fund his first series of subversive actions. He began to print seditious leaflets agitating for political upheaval, and these began to attract people to the movement. All these years later, the merit of those books has mostly been forgotten, because hardly anyone remembers Peter Pan himself. Only the princess remembers. She also remembers how, once all that was left of the memory from selling those books was a fond memory no better than a fairy tale, Peter Pan was able to keep the movement alive. It turned out Peter Pan, as even his friends called him then, in fact had a truly poetic soul, since only a poet would love flowers as much as he did. He planted the entire backyard of the rented house they used as their movement headquarters with flowers. He watered them every morning and afternoon with the tenderness of a god. Their blooms flourished, and after he plucked them, he would gather them into bouquets, which he sold on the campus boulevard, and there was no shortage of customers who were touched by their beauty. That was how he helped fund the printing of his political leaflets and flyers. But then his friends started running out of money, because once their parents heard they had joined Peter Pan in planning a guerrilla war, they stopped sending the money, and he was forced to abandon his flower garden and plant the yard with cassava, yams, corn, and other fruits and vegetables so they had something to eat. But truly, he wasn't the kind of person to run out of ideas. The princess remembers Peter Pan as someone who could attract larger-than-life figures to help with fundraising, like the billiard champion who chose to join his movement, leaving his dazzling professional career behind and going from one pool hall to another, betting on games. 9 against 1, he always won, and he supplied lots of cash, which was spent on printing all those leaflets and posters for the struggle. That was how Peter Pan got by. Until, once upon a time, it came to pass that suddenly, all at once, almost every student, labourer, merchant, office worker, and even civil servant took to the streets. They banded together in the shared belief that the dictator had become insupportable and could no longer be allowed to stay in office. His smile, which was always flashing on the television and was even printed on their paper currency, had grown quite galling. The days were spent demonstrating, again and again, every day with the same fervour and the same demand. Step down, Mr. President, before we burn you alive in the fire of revolution. Those were the most subversive days of the dictator's entire rule, which was already in its death throes. At the same time, Peter Pan met his most tragic fate. After he learned he was public enemy number 1, sought by the dictator's bloody hands, he went from one hideout to the next, until it came to pass that 3 horrific people arrested him at the princess's house, right before his lover's eyes. Even though he was now powerless, he was still an impressive figure. His eyes still shone, and he still sang hymns of struggle, even as they apprehended him. He was gagged, his face was covered with a black hood, and he was dragged away from the princess, who could do nothing but silently howl. That was the last time she ever saw her man. What befell him after that, not many, maybe nobody except the dictator, ever knew. But even when the dictator was finally overthrown, by the street protests, by the riots that swept through the cities after thousands of factory workers had been laid off, and by the war between soldiers and students, which flooded the television sets and newspapers with blood, we didn't find Peter Pan. We never had so much as a whiff of his rotting corpse. It was as if Peter Pan had disappeared, and so he became a mythical figure among us, who were left hapless. And that was how, after almost 2 years after the fall of that pathetic dictator, on the 10th of April, the date that had been promised, the princess carried out the wedding they had planned. Peter Pan was represented by a cluster of poems, all that was left of him. I myself attended their wedding and witnessed the princess weeping, just as all of the guests were weeping. Meanwhile, even though he was overthrown 2 years ago, the dictator keeps smiling. He is still healthy, still rich, still revolting, and most infuriatingly of all, he still rules, even though he no longer occupies the presidential office. Peter Pan, the princess's beloved, fought so hard to bring him down, but it's starting to seem like it was all for nothing. He paid far too great a cost for far too little change. That is why it feels right for the princess, and for all of us, to weep. We have appointed a new leader, but he can never make the dictator pay for all the evil he has done. And what's worse, he cannot return Peter Pan to us. Plus, that accursed smile is still printed on our bills. Thanks to all of this, not long after her peculiar wedding reception, the princess said to us, in an effort to cheer herself up, "It will be forever impossible to keep us from reading our novels and comic books, even though that great criminal, who is vile, vicious, dirty, and stinks of hell, is nearly impossible to defeat and always manages to cheat death." And I don't think I need to spell out to whom she was referring. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that. I also found this story interesting because of its looking at the important role of books in social and political change. So can you think of any other moments in history where books have played this important role, for better or for worse? What power do books hold in this sense, and what might be their limitations? And also, if you enjoyed the story but you don't know much about this period in Indonesian history, why not do a little bit of digging around to find out some more? So please share your thoughts and your findings in the comments section below, and don't forget to subscribe to listen and watch more stories from the 100 Stories Deep series. Bye!